You know that feeling when you're screaming in a room full of people but no one really hears you? Eduardo Mendes knew this deafening silence well. A billionaire at 42, owner of a corporate empire that generated millions daily, he lived surrounded by executives, advisors, and consultants who talked non-stop, but not a single word reached him. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Sofia was 19 and had never heard a sound in her life. But she heard things no one else could perceive. Two people, two worlds, an encounter no one expected. The story you're about to learn challenges everything we believe about communication. Because sometimes, those who don't listen with their ears are precisely those who see the deepest truth. Sofia had no degree, no connections, and didn't even have the ability to hear the words that move the business world. But she had something billions of dollars can't buy: the ability to read what people really mean when their mouths are lying. And it was precisely this gift that saved an entire empire from collapse. This is not a story about charity or pity. It's about how a deaf girl, working at an inclusive cafe for minimum wage, became a billionaire's most valuable consultant, not despite her deafness, but precisely because of it. It's about how silence can be more powerful than 1,000 words. It's about how sometimes we need to stop listening to finally understand. And it's about an unlikely friendship that proved that true communication has nothing to do with sound, but with soul. Since the age of 6, when a high fever robbed her of her hearing in Chicago, Sofia developed a unique visual universe where words were unnecessary. While other children played in Lincoln Park, she watched the birds and learned to read the universal language of gestures and expressions. Each person who crossed her path became an open book of unspoken emotions, stories told through the movements of eyes and hands. Deafness wasn't her prison. It was her secret superpower, a special lens that filtered the world's noise to reveal deeper truths. By 19, working at the Silent Brew Cafe in the heart of Manhattan, Sofia had honed her skill to the point of near supernatural innate power. She could predict which clients would cancel appointments based on how they held their cell phones, identify relationships on the brink of collapse through micro-gestures during conversations, and detect lies more accurately than any lie detector. As she prepared artful lattes, her mind unconsciously cataloged every movement, every blink, every shift in posture that revealed what the words tried to conceal. Her gift was both a blessing and a curse. She saw the raw truth behind every social smile, every professional handshake, every empty promise. In a world where everyone talked too much and listened too little, Sofia had become an archaeologist of human emotions, unearthing truths no one else perceived. And though she couldn't hear a single word, she understood the language of the human soul better than anyone with perfect hearing in bustling downtown New York. Eduardo Montgomery ran a 50-story tech empire in the heart of Silicon Valley, but each morning he woke up in a gilded cell of his own creation. His life was a perfect choreography of meetings atop the Montgomery Tower, dinners at 3 Michelin star restaurants in San Francisco, and private jet trips to meetings on Wall Street. Advisors smiled and nodded at every word. Analysts presented reports that confirmed his decisions. But amid all the noise, Eduardo had never felt so profoundly alone. The problem wasn't the numbers. His spreadsheets were mathematical masterpieces, his algorithms revolutionary, his net worth astronomical. The problem was the people. During meetings in the luxurious 50th floor boardroom, he watched executives nod in agreement while their bodies screamed resistance. He saw smiles that didn't reach their eyes, handshakes that conveyed distrust, body language that contradicted every word spoken. He had built an empire based on data, but the human data, the most important data, always eluded him. The crisis arrived silently during a presentation to investors in his office overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge. While his vice presidents showed impressive charts and optimistic projections, Eduardo noticed something disturbing. No one in the room truly believed what was being said. Smiles were forced, eyes avoided contact, feet pointed toward the door. In that moment, Silent Valley's most successful billionaire realized he was surrounded by polite lies, and that his empire was built on quicksand. Fate chose a rainy autumn day in New York to bring together two worlds that should never have met. Eduardo, fleeing yet another fruitless meeting on Wall Street, entered the Silent Brew Cafe, seeking refuge from the constant noise of his life. The place was unlike anything he had ever known. No background music, no hum of conversation, just the respectful silence between customers and baristas who communicated through tablets, gestures, and facial expressions. At the center of this tranquil universe was Sofia, moving with a grace that transformed every movement into visual poetry. As Eduardo tried to decipher the unusual menu, no prices, just emotional descriptions of the drinks, Sofia observed the new customer with professional interest. She immediately noticed his rigid posture, his fingers nervously drumming on the marble counter, his eyes scanning the room as if he were in a business meeting. When it was his turn to be served, he ordered a double espresso in the strained voice of someone accustomed to giving orders, not making requests. Sofia calmly prepared his drink while continuing to study every micro-expression on his face. The crucial moment came when Eduardo received a message on his smartphone. His face, previously tense, became a mask of suppressed despair. The numbers he trusted so much had betrayed his trust once again. With a sudden movement of frustration, he threw his phone onto the wooden table, the sound of the impact echoing in the silence of the cafe. It was then that Sofia approached, and with hands that seemed to dance in the air, signaled the words that would change everything. Calm down. Numbers lie, people never. While Eduardo struggled with spreadsheets on his tablet, completely immersed in his world of flawed numbers, Sofia continued her work of silent observation. From her perch behind the counter of the cafe in the heart of Times Square, she saw stories unfold that no one else noticed. The couple in the corner feigning happiness but whose bodies maintained a careful distance. The businessman smiling into his phone while his feet tapped impatiently on the floor. The woman who said, "I'm fine," with her mouth, but whose eyes spoke of a personal tragedy. Each customer was a universe of unspoken truths. Sofia had developed a nearly unconscious reading system that operated on multiple layers. She noticed how people held their cups. Those confidently wrapped their hands around them completely. Those insecurely gripped them by the handles with excessive care. She observed the direction of their feet during conversations, pointing toward the interested person or the nearest exit. She captured micro-expressions that lasted fractions of a second but revealed genuine emotions before social masks were put on. While the world around her communicated through words, she read the open book of body language. The moment of insight came when she observed a group of executives excitedly discussing a new product. While everyone at the table displayed verbal enthusiasm, their bodies told a different story. Arms crossed, legs turned away from each other, smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Sofia realized that the product was doomed to failure not because of technical issues, but because no one on the team truly believed in it. The truth was there, visible to anyone who knew how to read the signs that words desperately tried to hide. Eduardo's initial reaction was pure irritation. Who was this girl giving him advice? But something about Sofia's absolute calm, the serenity of her gestures, gave him pause. As his advisors whispered dismissive comments about the barista who thought she was a psychologist, Eduardo felt an unusual curiosity. He looked at the numbers on his screen, then at Sofia, and for the first time in years, questioned whether he was looking at the right things. The girl wasn't trying to sell anything. She was simply sharing a genuine observation. Sofia, sensing she had awakened something in the man, continued her silent communication. With precise gestures and facial expressions that conveyed more emotion than 1,000 words, she signaled, "Look around you. People say one thing, their bodies say another." She discreetly pointed to a client who claimed to be excited about a business opportunity, while his fingers nervously drummed on the table. She pointed to another who professed complete confidence, while his feet bounced anxiously under the chair. Each example was a vivid lesson in the disconnect between words and truth. Eduardo, against all corporate logic he knew, decided to give the impossible a chance. Instead of ignoring the girl or leaving the cafe, he did something that surprised even himself. He turned off his tablet, took a deep breath, and with clumsy hands tried to sign, "Show me more." At that moment, in the middle of the bustling Manhattan cafe, a billionaire and a deaf barista struck up a conversation that defied all conventions about how people should communicate in the business world. Eduardo's aides couldn't contain their disdain when they saw their boss trying to communicate with the signal girl, the oldest of them. A vice president with 30 years of Wall Street experience laughed openly. "Eduardo, are you really going to take business advice from a barista who can't even hear?" he said sarcastically. Others joined in the chorus of mockery, calling the situation corporate nonsense and a waste of valuable time that could be spent in real meetings in the financial district. Sofia, accustomed to this kind of reaction, maintained her composure. She observed each executive individually, picking up on their insecurities through almost imperceptible micro-gestures. The vice president who laughed the loudest was precisely the one who crossed his arms most defensively, the one who called the situation absurd, avoided direct eye contact, the one who talked about valuable time, checked his wristwatch every 2 minutes. Her silent reading revealed that their disdain stemmed not from trust, but from fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of losing control, fear that someone inferior might see what they couldn't. Eduardo faced the first test of his new intuition. He could give in to peer pressure, follow the familiar safe path, or he could trust the instinct that told him Sofia saw something his Harvard and Stanford advisors were blind to. Looking at the condescending faces of his team and then at Sofia's serene expression, he made a decision that would change everything. "Maybe it's time we learn to truly listen," he said calmly, ignoring the looks of disbelief around him. Sofia, sitting at a nearby table, continued her meticulous observation of the cafe's surroundings. Her eyes picked up patterns that executives too busy with their smartphones missed. She noticed how customers reacted to new product ads on their screens. Some scrolled quickly with genuine disinterest. Others paused for a split second with genuine curiosity before moving on. These micro-signals, invisible to most, formed a clear map of acceptance or rejection that no market research could capture with such precision. The moment of revelation came when a group of young professionals began discussing exactly what kind of product Eduardo's company was developing. While they verbally expressed interest, their bodies told a different story. Phones set aside, relaxed postures that indicated a lack of real engagement, eyes that wandered around the room instead of focusing on the conversation. Sofia realized that the problem wasn't the product itself, but the emotional disconnect it created. People wanted technology, but not at the expense of human authenticity. With a courage that surprised even herself, Sofia approached Eduardo's desk and, using her tablet, typed a message that would make any data analyst tremble. "Your product will fail, not because of technical issues, but because no one really wants what it offers. People are tired of empty connections. They want real conversations." The statement was as blunt as it was accurate, based not on statistical data, but on a raw reading of human desire that shone through in every gesture, every expression, every unconscious movement of the customers around her. Eduardo felt a chill run down his spine as he read Sofia's words. Every analyst, every consulting firm, every market report he'd paid dearly for had said the exact opposite. That his product was revolutionary, that the market was hungry for innovation, that success was guaranteed. But something about the girl's quiet certainty, the way she based her observations not on projections but on real human behavior, made him doubt everything he'd been told. For the first time in his career, Eduardo Montgomery was about to bet his empire on a hunch. The executives around him couldn't contain their indignation. "This is crazy, Eduardo. You're going to ignore millions in market research because of the feelings of a girl who serves coffee?" The marketing director protested. Others joined in, citing Ivy League degrees, decades of experience, and proven success stories. The pressure was intense, the ridicule almost palpable. But Eduardo, looking at Sofia and then at his advisors, saw something crucial. She was calm and confident. They were nervous and defensive. With a deep sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all his past decisions, Eduardo made the most counterintuitive choice of his life. "Let's test her theory," he announced, ignoring the collective groans of his team. "For a week, we'll observe people the way Sofia observes. If she's wrong, we'll go back to normal. If she's right." He didn't need to finish the sentence. The silence that followed was more eloquent than any words. A billionaire had just placed his future in the hands of an intuition that defied all corporate logic. The outcry erupted as soon as Eduardo announced his decision in the 50th floor boardroom. Executives who had built entire careers based on data and logic couldn't accept that their CEO was listening to body sensing. "This is the height of absurdity, Eduardo," the CFO exploded, slamming his hand on the mahogany desk. "We have algorithms that process millions of data points, and you prefer the instincts of a girl who can't even listen to a business presentation." Sofia, watching through the mirrored glass of the meeting room, clearly saw the power dynamics unfold. She noted how the older executives formed a silent alliance through exchanged glances, how the younger ones hesitated to support Eduardo for fear of reprisal, how each person's body language revealed their true loyalties and fears. While the words in the room spoke of logic and rationality, the bodies told a story of insecurity and resistance to change. Eduardo faced his first leadership crisis since the decision. His top executives threatened mass layoffs. Shareholders began calling in concerned, and even his brother and co-founder called from London questioning his sanity. The pressure was immense, but every time Eduardo looked at Sofia through the glass and saw the absolute calm in her eyes, he felt a certainty that transcended all logic. The battle was no longer about numbers or products. It was about a fundamental vision of how the business should be run. The moment of truth arrived during the board meeting, where Eduardo would need to defend his controversial decision to Montgomery Tech's most powerful shareholders. The room was tense, with senior executives sitting in disapproving silence as Eduardo prepared his presentation. Traditionally, he would have presented slides with impressive charts and optimistic projections, but this time his approach would be radically different. He would rely entirely on Sofia's observations. Sofia, strategically positioned behind the mirrored glass, observed every micro-expression of the board members. She immediately noticed that the board president, despite his seemingly open posture, kept his feet pointed toward the door, a clear sign that his mind was already made up against the proposal. Other members showed more subtle signs of resistance through the way they held their pens or the frequency with which they checked their watches. Through discrete messages on her tablet, Sofia guided Eduardo on which emotional approach would work with each board member. When Eduardo began speaking, he completely ignored the numbers and focused exclusively on the human observations Sofia had made. "Mr. Thompson," he said, looking directly at the board chairman, "your experience tells you we should trust the data, but what the data doesn't show is that our clients are tired of being treated like numbers." The room fell into absolute silence as Eduardo, guided by Sofia's reading, connected with each advisor on a deeply human level, proving that true courage in business lies not in taking the safe route, but in trusting in the unseen. Sofia's first days at Montgomery Tower were a study in cultural contrasts. As employees moved briskly through the smoked glass corridors, speaking in corporate jargon and checking expensive wristwatches, she observed in absolute silence. Her presence on the 50th floor, the sanctuary of executive power, caused both astonishment and curiosity. Why had the CEO brought a deaf barista into the heart of his tech empire? The whispers in the company cafes were constant, the theories wild, the skepticism palpable. Sofia began her observation during board meetings, sitting discreetly in a corner of the luxurious conference room. As executives debated market strategies and financial projections, she focused on elements no one else noticed. The vice president who verbally agreed but whose fingers drummed impatiently on the table, the director who smiled while her feet bounced anxiously under her chair, the manager who maintained constant eye contact with Eduardo, but whose eyes wandered around the room when others spoke. Each meeting was a goldmine of nonverbal information. Sofia's first major discovery came during a discussion about a potential billion-dollar acquisition. While all the data pointed to an excellent opportunity, she noticed something disturbing. Whenever the topic was mentioned, several executives would cross their arms or legs, change their posture, or display micro-expressions of distrust. Using her tablet, she warned Eduardo, "They don't believe in this acquisition. They're following the numbers, not their intuition." The observation was as blunt as it was accurate, and completely challenged the official narrative that everyone verbally supported. Sofia quickly realized that Montgomery Tower was a theater where each executive played a carefully choreographed role. During budget meetings, she spotted the CFO, who professed complete confidence in the numbers, while his fingers trembled slightly as he flipped through the pages of the presentation. In discussions about international expansion, she noticed the VP of Operations who verbally supported the strategy, but whose feet consistently pointed toward the door, a clear sign of a desire to escape the conversation. Every gesture, every facial expression, every unconscious movement told a story that words desperately tried to hide. The most shocking revelation came during a crucial meeting with venture capital investors. As the development director presented impressive figures about a new product, Sofia noticed something that left Eduardo perplexed. Three of the senior executives exchanging barely perceptible glances and tiny smiles when specific numbers were mentioned. Through her tablet, she explained, "They know these numbers are inflated. The smiles are of complicity, not pride." The discovery was devastating. People close to Eduardo were deliberately misleading investors. Eduardo confronted the executives in question after the meeting, and to everyone's surprise, they immediately admitted it. The marketing director explained, embarrassed, "We inflated the numbers because we knew you would never approve the project with the real numbers." The confession completely validated Sofia's reading and exposed a sick corporate culture where truth was sacrificed for the sake of what looked good on paper. Body language had betrayed what words carefully concealed. Sofia discovered that her deafness, far from being a limitation, was actually her greatest asset in the corporate environment. While other executives were distracted by tone of voice, intonation, and wordplay, she focused exclusively on pure nonverbal communication. Without the constant noise of conversations, her mind processed visual information with a clarity others couldn't achieve. She saw patterns where others saw chaos, connections where others saw coincidences, truths where others saw only superficialities. Her observation method was meticulous and systematic. During meetings, she unconsciously cataloged dozens of variables simultaneously. The direction of feet indicating genuine interest or a desire to escape, eye contact conveying confidence or evasion, posture revealing engagement or resistance, hand movements demonstrating certainty or doubt. While others debated words, she read the silent symphony of body language that told the real story behind every corporate decision. Sofia's most profound insight came when she realized that Montgomery Tech's biggest problems weren't technical or financial. They were human. Divisions between departments were visible in the way executives sat in meetings. A lack of trust in leadership was evident in the glances exchanged when Eduardo spoke, and resistance to innovation manifested itself in defensive postures during discussions about change. The company needed not new products, but authentic communication, and Sofia had the tools to provide just that. The ultimate test of Sofia's methodology came when Montgomery Tech considered acquiring an artificial intelligence startup for $800 million. All the data, market analysis, financial due diligence, growth projections, strongly supported the acquisition. Outside advisors, internal analysts, and even competitors considered the deal a brilliant move. But during the final approval meeting, Sofia noticed something no one else did. As the startup CEO presented his impressive numbers, Sofia noticed his eyes didn't follow his words when he mentioned certain metrics. His gestures were wide and theatrical when talking about the past, but became restrained and precise when discussing future projections. Even more telling, whenever a Montgomery executive asked a specific technical question, the startup CEO gave vague answers while his feet moved almost imperceptibly toward the door. Through her tablet, Sofia warned Eduardo, "He's hiding something. The numbers may be real, but his confidence in them isn't." Eduardo, against the unanimous advice of his team and advisors, decided to postpone the acquisition for further investigation. 2 weeks later, they discovered that the startup was engaged in questionable accounting practices and that its growth projections were wildly optimistic. What would have been an $800 million disaster was avoided not by data analysis, but by accurately reading the body language of a man who knew he was selling illusions. Sofia's first strategic success silenced many of her fiercest critics. Eduardo began his transformation almost imperceptibly. During meetings, instead of focusing solely on the words being spoken, he now unconsciously observed the participants' body language. He noticed how his marketing director always crossed his arms when internally disagreed with a decision, how the CFO avoided eye contact when numbers were questioned, how different departments formed visible alliances through their arrangement at the conference table. Little by little, he was learning to listen with his eyes, a skill no MBA had taught him. His new insight fundamentally altered how he conducted business. Instead of blindly relying on reports, he now observed how people presented those reports. During investor pitches, he paid attention not only to what was said, but also to how it was communicated. The genuine energy versus the forced enthusiasm, the authentic confidence versus the defensive arrogance. He began asking different questions, focusing not on numbers, but on feelings and intuition, much to the dismay of his more traditional analysts. The most profound change, however, occurred in how Eduardo communicated. He began speaking more slowly, pausing strategically to observe reactions, and using more hand gestures to emphasize important points. His presentations became less about data and more about human connection. Employees noticed the difference. For the first time, they felt they were being truly heard, not just processed. Eduardo Montgomery was transforming from a boss who commanded through numbers to a leader who connected through genuine understanding. Organized resistance began to form quietly in the corridors of Montgomery Tower. Veteran executives who had built their careers based on hard data and traditional methodologies felt threatened by the rise of the signal girl. They began meeting quietly after work hours, sharing their frustration with what they called the company's new mystical era, where intuition trumped rational analysis. The confrontation became inevitable during a strategic planning meeting when the senior vice president of operations openly challenged Eduardo. "With all due respect, Eduardo, but we're becoming a corporate joke," he declared, looking directly at Sofia. "Consultants are asking if we're going to start reading tarot cards at upcoming board meetings. Wall Street is laughing at us. We need to get back to the fundamentals that built this empire." The statement was a disguised ultimatum. The old guard was getting its message across. Edward faced the most difficult moment of his leadership. He could either bow to the pressure and fire Sofia, restoring harmony with his most senior executives, or he could defend his revolutionary vision, risking an internal rebellion. Looking at the hard faces of his vice presidents and then at Sofia's serene expression, he made his decision. The foundations that built this empire are leading us to irrelevance. Either we evolve with Sofia, or we will be forgotten by history. The line was drawn. It was the old guard versus the new vision. Sofia began to realize that her gift went far beyond simply reading individuals. She could detect collective patterns of behavior that predicted market trends before they manifested in the numbers. During meetings with large groups of employees, she noticed how certain themes generated specific bodily reactions that spread throughout the room like waves. When a product truly resonated with people, there was a visible energy, postures that opened, smiles that became genuine, eye contact that intensified. When something wasn't working, the opposite happened. Arms crossed, feet shifted restlessly, eyes lost. Her most valuable insight came during the launch of a new app that all market research indicated was a guaranteed success. While the marketing team was presenting impressive numbers, Sofia noticed something crucial. Montgomery Tech's own employees were showing subtle signs of disinterest when using the app. They scrolled quickly, their fingers tapped impatiently, their expressions one of masked boredom. Through her tablet, she warned Eduardo, "Our own people aren't engaged with the product. If we can't convince the people who work here, how are we going to convince the market?" The discovery led to a complete overhaul of the launch strategy. Instead of relying on surveys, the team focused on creating an experience that would generate genuine excitement among employees first. The result was a launch that exceeded all expectations, proving that true success doesn't come from following data, but from creating authentic emotional connections. Sofia had discovered that her unique talent wasn't reading people, but reading the human truth behind the numbers. Sofia began to question her role at Montgomery Tech after receiving anonymous messages from members of the deaf community. "You've sold out to capitalism," wrote one. "You're using your gift to help billionaires get richer while our community remains marginalized," accused another. The words cut deeply, making her question whether she was betraying her own roots by working at the heart of the corporate establishment that traditionally excluded people like her. The internal crisis intensified when she visited her old school for the deaf in Brooklyn. Her former teachers and classmates looked at her with a mixture of admiration and distrust. "It's great that you've achieved so much, Sofia," her former sign language teacher said, "but don't forget where you came from and why we fight so hard for real inclusion, not just corporate charity." The words echoed in her mind as she returned to her luxury apartment paid for by Montgomery Tech. The hardest night came when she stayed awake until dawn, staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. She saw herself wearing designer clothes she could never have afforded with her barista salary, living in an apartment overlooking Central Park, attending corporate dinners where she was treated with superficial respect. But who had she become? The deaf girl who read people, or the corporate consultant who helped billionaires? The line between using her gift to create change and being used by the system that had always excluded her was becoming dangerously thin. Sofia's visit to her mother in their modest Queens apartment was fraught with unspoken tension. As they prepared dinner in the small kitchen that had witnessed so many financial struggles, her mother watched her daughter's every move with eyes that mixed pride and concern. "Those new clothes, Sofia," she commented, running her hand over the expensive fabric of her daughter's coat. Remember when we had to choose between paying for heating or buying school supplies? Now you wear clothes that cost more than our monthly rent. During dinner, the conversation inevitably turned to Sofia's work. "I don't understand, daughter," her mother said, cutting her steak with precise movements. "You spent your whole life fighting against a system that ignored us, and now you're inside that world helping them get even richer? These businessmen, they don't see you as an equal. You're a curiosity to them, an exotic tool." The words were harsh, but they came from a place of protective love that knew all too well the injustices of the world. Sofia tried to explain, but her words seemed inadequate in the face of her mother's skepticism. "I'm trying to change the system from within, Mom," she signed, her hands moving with unusual intensity. "If no one from our community is at the decision-making table, we will always be excluded." Her mother shook her head slowly, her eyes filled with wisdom gained through decades of struggle. "Just be careful, Sofia. Sometimes when we sit at their table too long, we forget our chair is borrowed." The night after visiting her mother was the loneliest of Sofia's life. Sitting in her luxury apartment overlooking the Manhattan skyline, she stared out at the city lights that now seemed both an opportunity and a temptation. On one side was the community that raised her, the struggles that shaped her resilience, the values of solidarity that were her moral foundation. On the other was a unique platform to create change on a global scale, the chance to prove that the skills of the deaf community had real strategic value, not just charitable ones. Sofia spent hours mentally replaying every interaction at Montgomery Tower. She remembered the disdainful looks from the senior executives when she arrived, the subtle jokes about her deafness, the initial resistance. But she also remembered the moment Eduardo decided to trust her against all advice, the small victories when her observations prevented catastrophic mistakes, the employees who began to genuinely listen to each other. She realized she was in a unique position. She could be the bridge between two worlds that had never understood each other. At dawn, Sofia made her decision. She wouldn't abandon Montgomery Tech, but she would renegotiate her terms. Instead of being just a consultant, she would become an agent of cultural change. She would use her position to create real inclusion programs, not symbolic gestures. She would show that the deaf community didn't need pity. It needed recognition for the unique value it brought. Her decision wasn't about getting rich. It was about using the wealth and influence she had gained to open doors that had remained closed to people like her. The most anticipated moment arrived when Eduardo announced he would bring Sofia to the annual investor conference in Las Vegas, the event where Montgomery Tech's future would be decided. Traditionally, these presentations were dominated by slides packed with numbers, complex charts, and corporate jargon. This time, it would be different. Eduardo decided Sofia would be on stage with him, communicating directly with the audience through sign language, while an interpreter translated her remarks in real time. The tension backstage was palpable minutes before the presentation. Old school executives tried one last time to dissuade Eduardo. "This is crazy. Wall Street investors won't take seriously a presentation that relies on body reading," the CFO argued. But Eduardo was determined. "For decades, we've been showing them numbers. This time we're going to show them the truth." Sofia, wearing an elegant suit that contrasted with her usual jeans from the cafe, appeared calm, but her fingers trembled slightly, a sign only she noticed. When the curtains opened on the Venetian Resort's gigantic auditorium, more than 1,000 of the world's most powerful investors stared at them. Eduardo began his presentation conventionally, but after 5 minutes, he did something no one expected. He stopped talking and handed the stage over to Sofia. "For years, we've shown you what our numbers say," he announced. "Today, I'm going to show you what our people really feel." The silence that followed was more eloquent than any applause. The quiet revolution was about to begin. Sofia took center stage with a calm that seemed to counter the nervous energy of the audience. Instead of immediately launching into conversation, she did something that left everyone perplexed. She remained completely silent for a full 30 seconds, her eyes slowly scanning the audience. This strategic silence created an electrifying curiosity in the room. Investors who had previously been checking their smartphones stopped. Executives who had been talking quietly fell silent, and all eyes fixed on her, trying to decipher what would come next. When Sofia finally began communicating through sign language, every movement of her hands was calculated for maximum impact. She didn't just convey information, she performed emotions. Her broad, dramatic gestures for grand concepts contrasted with precise, restrained movements for technical details. Her facial expressions amplified each point, transforming abstract data into tangible emotional experiences. The vocal interpreter translated her words, but it was Sofia's physical performance that truly communicated the message. The most powerful moment came when Sofia paused again in the middle of an explanation about innovation, her eyes fixed on a specific group of investors at the back of the room. Through her interpreter, she said, "You gentlemen back there, you don't believe we can innovate while maintaining our human values. Your bodies say, 'Show me,' while your words say, 'Convince me.'" The precision of her observation caused a murmur in the audience. For the first time, someone was reading not just the room, but each individual in it, and responding not to what they said, but to what they truly felt. Midway through the presentation, as Sofia explained Montgomery Tech's new human-centric philosophy, she noticed something crucial about the investors sitting in the front rows. Whenever specific growth figures were mentioned, several of them displayed micro-expressions of skepticism, slightly pursed lips, almost imperceptibly furrowed brows, small adjustments in their postures. These signs, invisible to most, indicated that the financial projections, while mathematically sound, didn't resonate emotionally with those who truly mattered. Sofia paused dramatically, and through her interpreter, made a statement that left Eduardo stunned. "We need to change our entire growth strategy. The numbers we're showing are technically correct, but emotionally wrong." She explained that investors didn't doubt the math, but they doubted the company's ability to execute this vision while maintaining its human values. The audience fell into absolute silence. No one had ever interrupted an investor presentation to declare that the entire strategy was fundamentally flawed. Eduardo faced the quickest decision of his career. He could ignore Sofia's observation and continue with his prepared script, risking losing the audience's trust, or he could completely trust his reading and pivot instantly. Looking at the investors' faces and seeing the truth in the micro-expressions Sofia had identified, he made his decision. "Sofia is right," he announced, closing his prepared presentation. "Instead of showing you numbers, I'm going to show you our soul." The turnaround was complete. The numbers had been defeated by human truth. Eduardo's decision to completely abandon his prepared presentation and blindly trust Sofia's reading was the most courageous act of his corporate career. For 30 years, he had followed the Wall Street playbook: impressive numbers, optimistic projections, absolute trust in data. Now, he was throwing that playbook away and betting everything on intuition based on micro-expressions and body language. The advisors behind the scenes looked like they were about to have a heart attack, but Eduardo remained calm, his eyes fixed on Sofia like a beacon in the midst of the storm. When Eduardo began speaking without slides, numbers, or any traditional visual aids, his voice fundamentally changed. The polished corporate tone gave way to a raw authenticity the audience had never witnessed before. He spoke not about profits and market share, but about the people behind the products, the real stories that inspired each innovation, the human values that guided each decision. His hands, previously restrained during presentations, now gestured naturally, unconsciously mirroring Sofia's expressive communication. The transformation was visible in the audience. Investors who had previously sat back in their chairs skeptically now leaned forward, genuinely engaged. Eyes that had wandered from smartphones now fixed on Eduardo with renewed interest. The energy in the room shifted from calculated assessment to genuine connection. Eduardo, guided by Sofia's accurate reading, had accomplished the impossible. He transformed a standard corporate presentation into an authentic human conversation, proving that true courage in business lies not in following the script, but in having the audacity to rewrite it live. The immediate reaction after the presentation was a charged silence that lasted for several seconds, followed by a wave of applause that began slowly and quickly became a standing ovation. Investors who normally reserved their approval for exceptional numbers were clapping with a genuine enthusiasm that transcended financial considerations. Success wasn't measured in dollars at that moment, but in authentic human connection, something rarely witnessed in the halls of corporate power. In the hours that followed, the video of the presentation went viral on corporate social media. Executives around the world shared clips of Sofia reading the audience with surgical precision, and Eduardo abandoning numbers to speak from the heart. The Wall Street Journal headline the next day captured the general sentiment: Montgomery Tech redefines corporate communications. Numbers lose to neurodiversity. The same critics who had ridiculed Eduardo weeks earlier now praised his revolutionary vision and uncommon courage. Inside Montgomery Tower, the mood shifted instantly. Old-school executives who had threatened to resign now approached Sofia with renewed respect. "I've never seen anything like this in 30 years on Wall Street," the CFO admitted, his previously defensive demeanor now open and receptive. The success not only validated Sofia's methodology, it permanently silenced critics and proved that the future of business belonged not to those who manipulated numbers best, but to those who understood people best. At the height of his success, when investment offers were exceeding billions, and analysts predicted Montgomery Tech's shares would rise 40% at the market opening, Eduardo did what no one expected. Instead of celebrating with champagne and interviews with the financial media, he called Sofia to his office at the top of the tower and made a proposal that left even her speechless. "I want you to become my partner," he declared, placing documents on the table that gave Sofia a significant equity stake in the company. Not as a consultant, not as an employee, as an equal partner. The proposal was revolutionary on multiple levels. No person with a disability had ever reached such a position at a company the size of Montgomery Tech. No CEO had offered a partnership to someone without a traditional corporate background, and certainly no one had recognized that the skills of the deaf community had strategic value equivalent to decades of business experience. The documents on the table represented not only wealth, but historical validation that neurodiversity was an asset, not a liability. Sofia froze, her hands trembling slightly as she examined the documents. This would mean completely abandoning her previous life, becoming permanently part of the corporate world she had so criticized, accepting a responsibility that went far beyond observing meetings. But it would also mean having real power to implement change, to influence corporate policies on a global scale, to definitively prove that people with disabilities belonged at the tables where decisions were made. Eduardo's response wasn't about generosity, it was about recognizing genuine value. Accepting Eduardo's offer unleashed a storm of criticism within the deaf community that Sofia loved so much. On social media, blogs, and online forums, she was accused of selling out to capital, betraying the fight for authentic inclusion, and becoming the mascot of billionaires. Harsh messages from former friends from deaf school arrived daily, questioning how she could justify working for a man whose company had never hired people with disabilities before her. The guilt weighed on her shoulders more than any corporate responsibility. The lowest point came when Sofia was invited to speak at an annual conference of the deaf community and was met with silent protests. As she took the stage, dozens of people stood up and turned their backs, their hands forming the sign for traitor. The pain was as physical as it was emotional. These were people who had fought alongside her for accessibility, who understood her struggles like no one else could, who were her chosen family. Now they saw her as the enemy. Sofia spent the next night awake, replaying every decision that had led her to this point. She wondered if she had crossed an invisible line between using the system to change it and becoming part of it. Had the luxury apartment, the $1 million salary, and access to the corridors of power clouded her judgment? Did the girl who served coffee in Brooklyn still exist inside the billionaire partner of Montgomery Tech? The crisis wasn't about money or power. It was about identity and loyalty to the community that had shaped her. The turning point came when Eduardo, unannounced, showed up at the school for the deaf where Sofia had studied in Brooklyn. He arrived alone, without aides or security, wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt, a version of himself no one at Montgomery Tech had ever seen. For hours he simply observed, sitting discreetly in the back of the classroom, watching the interactions between teachers and students, witnessing the richness of communication that took place completely silently. When an 8-year-old approached Eduardo and, with curious gestures, asked why he was there, something fundamental changed within the billionaire. Unable to speak sign language, he tried to communicate through facial expressions and basic gestures. The patient and creative child began teaching him simple signs. At that moment, Eduardo was no longer the powerful CEO. He was simply a man learning to connect in a completely new way, vulnerable and genuinely interested. At the end of the visit, Eduardo met Sofia in the schoolyard. "Now, I understand," he said, his eyes moist. "This isn't about charity or forced inclusion. It's about recognizing that there are entire forms of intelligence and communication that our corporate world is blind to." The experience had transformed his fundamental understanding of what it truly meant to listen. It wasn't about physical hearing. but about openness to understanding radically different perspectives. The billionaire had finally understood that his own deafness to the human experience was far more limiting than any hearing impairment. At the next board meeting, Eduardo made an announcement that left Wall Street in shock. Instead of focusing on maximizing quarterly profits as expected, he presented a radical corporate restructuring plan. Starting today, he declared, we will measure our success not just by financial metrics, but by our human connection index, how genuinely we connect with employees, customers, and communities. The proposal included concrete goals: 30% neurodiverse hiring by the end of the year, a complete overhaul of all processes to ensure true accessibility, and the creation of a corporate emotional intelligence department led by Sofia. Shareholder reaction was immediate and furious. "This is corporate suicide," shouted one of the largest investors on a conference call. "You're sacrificing shareholder returns for social experiments." Others threatened to sell their shares en masse, predicted a plummeting stock price, and demanded Eduardo's immediate resignation. The pressure was intense, but for once, Eduardo didn't care about Wall Street's approval. He was following a deeper conviction that transcended financial considerations. Sofia, watching the meeting, felt a mixture of terror and admiration. Eduardo was risking everything he had built: his fortune, his reputation, his corporate legacy, for a vision she herself wasn't yet entirely certain of. When he finished his presentation and looked at her through the glass, his eyes said it all. Some things are worth more than money. Some truths are more important than profits. And some revolutions need to start not in the streets, but in the boardrooms where real power resides. Sofia formally accepted the position of Vice President of Corporate Emotional Intelligence, becoming the first deaf executive at a Fortune 500 company. But her immediate focus wasn't implementing programs within Montgomery Tech. It was creating an initiative that connected global corporations with marginalized communities. She established the Bridge program, where companies learned nonverbal communication skills from deaf instructors, while communities with disabilities received corporate skills training. The approach was one of mutual exchange, not one-sided charity. The impact was immediate and profound. Other companies in Silent Valley, initially skeptical, began copying the model when they saw Montgomery Tech's results. More cohesive teams, sharper decision-making, and more authentic innovation. Sofia became a globally sought-after consultant, but always maintained her commitment to the community that had shaped her. Half of her income went to scholarships for deaf youth, and she used her influence to ensure that other companies adopted similar practices of true inclusion. The most lasting legacy, however, was the transformation in how corporations viewed diversity. It was no longer about filling quotas or symbolic gestures. It was about recognizing that different life experiences create different forms of intelligence essential for business success. Sofia had become the living bridge between two worlds that previously ignored each other, proving that true inclusion doesn't happen when people with disabilities are accepted in the corporate world, but when the corporate world learns to value what only they can offer. Montgomery Tech's culture radically transformed in the months following the implementation of the Bridge program. Meetings that were once dominated by endless PowerPoint presentations now included silent listening sessions, where participants observed each other's body language before engaging in verbal discussions. Employees learned to recognize when colleagues were genuinely engaged versus simply agreeing for the sake of convenience. Corporate communication became less about talking and more about understanding, a quiet revolution that dramatically increased efficiency and innovation. Departments that had previously operated in silos now collaborated surprisingly effectively. The engineering team, traditionally focused on pure data, began incorporating emotional observations from Sofia's team into their development processes. The marketing department, in turn, learned to read genuine excitement versus forced enthusiasm during product testing. The entire company was becoming fluent in the nonverbal language that previously only Sofia fully understood, and the results showed not only in better products but in happier, more engaged employees. The most notable success came when Montgomery Tech launched its first product developed entirely under the new philosophy, a communication app that prioritized authentic emotional connection over empty engagement. Unlike competitors who measured success by screen time, Montgomery's app measured interaction quality through nonverbal indicators. The product not only exceeded market expectations, it became a case study in how companies could thrive when they learned to truly listen to their customers, not just collect their data. Sofia designed Montgomery Tech's inclusion program with a philosophy radically different from traditional models. Instead of focusing on accommodations and adaptations, the program focused on valuing the unique abilities that neurodivergences bring. Autistic individuals were recruited for their pattern recognition abilities, people with ADHD for their non-linear creative thinking, and deaf individuals for their enhanced visual perception. The approach was not to fix disabilities but to leverage cognitive differences. The program included mandatory training for all employees in nonverbal communication, taught by instructors from the deaf community. Executives who previously disdained body reading now spent hours learning to decipher micro-expressions in body language. The most surprising thing was seeing how these skills improved not only the work environment, but also client negotiations, investor presentations, and even team dynamics. Inclusion went from being an operational cost to a competitive advantage. The results were quantifiable and impressive. Employee turnover dropped 40%, job satisfaction reached record levels, and innovation accelerated dramatically. Other companies began copying the Montgomery model, and Sofia became a consultant for global corporations interested in replicating its success. The program definitively proved that true inclusion wasn't about charity, it was about business intelligence, about recognizing that cognitive diversity was as valuable as diversity of background or experience. The success of the Montgomery model sparked a quiet revolution in the global corporate world. Companies that previously considered diversity an HR project began to recognize its true strategic value. Consulting firms specializing in corporate emotional intelligence emerged, many founded by people from the deaf community who discovered an untapped market for their unique skills. Wall Street, initially skeptical, began including cognitive diversity metrics in its company evaluations. Montgomery Tech became a case study at every major business school, but the most important lesson went beyond numbers or strategy. It was about a fundamental shift in how corporate success was defined. Companies that adopted the model reported not only better financial performance, but also more authentic innovation, sharper decision-making, and more resilient organizational cultures. The revolution proved that understanding people was as crucial as understanding markets. The most profound impact, however, was on how corporations viewed their role in society. Instead of focusing exclusively on maximizing profits for shareholders, leading companies began to measure success by their positive human impact as well. The revolution initiated by Sofia and Eduardo showed that businesses could be a force for good when they learned to value not just what people produced, but who they were in their entirety. With all their differences and unique abilities, Sofia became a global figure almost overnight. Her story graced the cover of Time magazine with the headline, "The Girl Who Teaches Wall Street to Listen." She was invited to speak at the United Nations about neurodiversity in the workplace, at the World Economic Forum about the future of conscious capitalism, and at elite universities about authentic communication. Each presentation was a masterclass in how to genuinely connect with an audience, regardless of language or cultural barriers. The most significant recognition came when Sofia received the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her contributions to corporate inclusion. During the White House ceremony, she did not use a voice interpreter. Instead, the president and all guests learned basic sign language phrases for the occasion. This symbolic gesture represented a much larger cultural shift. The world was learning that true inclusion meant finding ways to communicate that worked for everyone, not just the majority. Despite her global fame, Sofia remained committed to her roots. She used her platform to amplify the voices of other people with disabilities, created a foundation to support neurodiverse entrepreneurs, and continued to live in the same modest Brooklyn neighborhood where she grew up. Her refusal to distance herself from her roots became a powerful part of her message, that true success didn't mean leaving behind who you were, but using your position to elevate others like you. Eduardo and Sofia's relationship evolved from a professional partnership into a genuine friendship that completely transcended their differences in background, age, and life experience. They developed a habit of meeting on Saturdays at the same cafe where they met, now not as billionaire and barista, but as two friends discussing everything from corporate philosophy to books and films. In these conversations, there was no hierarchy, just two people who had learned to communicate on a deeply human level. Eduardo, who previously saw people primarily through their corporate roles, began to understand Sofia as a whole person. He learned about her struggles growing up deaf in a hearing world, her dreams beyond business, her unique sense of humor that manifested itself through elaborate facial expressions. Sofia, in turn, saw beyond the powerful billionaire to the man who carried the weight of thousands of jobs and a complicated legacy. Their friendship proved that the most meaningful connections often occur between those who seem to have the least in common. The most touching moment of their friendship came when Eduardo accompanied Sofia to a deaf community event and, for the first time, communicated directly with people using the basic sign language he had learned. His gestures were awkward, his signs imperfect, but the genuine effort deeply touched everyone present. In that moment, there was no billionaire and consultant, just two friends navigating two worlds together, proving that true friendship doesn't require perfect communication, only authentic connection. Eduardo discovered through his work with Sofia that his own emotional deafness was far more limiting than any hearing impairment. For decades, he had operated in a mode where people were variables in equations, emotions were noise to be filtered, and genuine connections were distractions from the pursuit of efficiency. Financial success masked a profound relational poverty. He had everything but felt nothing, surrounded by people but profoundly alone. The healing began when Eduardo began applying Sofia's lessons to his personal life. He noticed how his wife truly felt through her body language, not just her words. He learned to read genuine enthusiasm versus social obligation at family events. He discovered that his teenage children communicated much more through posture and facial expressions than through formal conversation. The home that had once been a perfect setting became a space for authentic connection. The most profound transformation came when Eduardo realized that his obsessive pursuit of corporate success had been, in large part, an attempt to fill a void that only genuine human connection could fill. The billionaire who once measured his worth by the zeros in his bank account now measured his wealth by the quality of his relationships. Healing came not from financial success, but from the rediscovery that the deeper purpose of business and of life was to serve and connect with other human beings. Business for neurodiverse entrepreneurs. The space maintained the coffee shop on the ground floor, but the upper floors became accessible offices for startups founded by people with disabilities. The place where Sofia served coffee to Eduardo was now home to dozens of companies, proving that cognitive diversity was a driver of innovation, not operational costs. Sofia also partnered with schools for the deaf across the country, creating programs that identified talented young sight readers and connected them with corporate opportunities. She proved that true return to one's roots wasn't about nostalgia, but about creating structures that allowed others to have the same opportunities she had, but with fewer obstacles and more support. The circle came full circle when Sofia invited her mother to visit the transformed community center. Seeing the building that once housed only a small coffee shop now pulsating with dozens of deaf entrepreneurs building empires, the tears in her mother's eyes spoke volumes. Sofia had proven that it was possible to navigate two worlds without losing your essence, and that true success meant building ladders for others to climb with you. The impact of Sofia and Eduardo's work extended far beyond the halls of Montgomery Tech. Elite business schools like Harvard and Stanford revised their curricula to include required courses on corporate emotional intelligence and nonverbal communication. The next generation of business leaders was being trained not just in finance and strategy, but in how to genuinely connect with people, a fundamental shift that promised to transform corporate culture for decades to come. In the technology sector, where innovation often trumped human consideration, a movement called Tech with Soul emerged. Startups founded by graduates of Sofia's program prioritized authentic human experience over empty engagement. Venture capital investors began including cognitive diversity metrics in their due diligence, recognizing that neurodiverse teams often produced more creative and resilient solutions. The most lasting legacy, however, was the shift in how society viewed the value of people with disabilities. No longer viewed primarily through the lens of charity or accommodation, they were now recognized as possessors of unique skills and valuable perspectives. Sofia's story proved that the greatest innovations often come not from following the established path, but from embracing differences that others considered limitations, turning what was once seen as weaknesses into strategic superpowers. 5 years after their transformative coffee meeting, Sofia and Eduardo launched their most ambitious initiative, the Global Alliance for Conscious Business. The organization brought together CEOs from 200 of the world's largest corporations committed to measuring success not just by financial metrics, but by positive human impact. The alliance's manifesto declared that the purpose of business in the 21st century was to create shared value, prosperity that benefits shareholders, employees, communities, and the planet equally. The alliance's most revolutionary initiative was the Human Connection Index, a standardized metric that measured how genuinely companies connected with all their stakeholders. Companies with high scores on the index received tax benefits, preferential treatment in government procurement, and access to privileged capital. Wall Street, which had previously derided the approach, now included the index in its valuations. The market had finally recognized that companies that understood people were better long-term investments. Sofia and Eduardo envisioned a future where neurodiversity was not the exception, but the norm in corporate boardrooms, where different forms of intelligence were equally valued, where success was measured not just by financial growth, but by human growth. Their vision proved that the greatest innovation in business was not technological, but philosophical. The understanding that true progress happens when we learn to value not just what people produce, but who they are in their wonderfully diverse totality. The story reached its final moment when Sofia, now 24 and a self-made billionaire, returned to the Silent Brew Cafe not as a customer or employee, but as owner and mentor. She sat at the same table where Eduardo once vented his corporate frustrations, now observing a new generation of deaf young people serving coffee while developing their unique observation skills. The place had become a hotbed of talent where what was once seen as a limitation was now cultivated as a superpower. Eduardo, sitting across from her, was no longer the tense, overwhelmed CEO of years past. His gestures were calmer, his eyes more present, his posture more open. He wasn't frantically checking his smartphone every few minutes. He was completely engaged in the conversation, reading Sofia's body language with a skill he never imagined he possessed. The billionaire and the former barista had become two human beings who had taught each other the most valuable art, how to truly see and hear each other. The circle closed not with an ending, but with a new beginning. The revolution that began at a coffee table now echoed in boardrooms around the world. The girl who couldn't hear sounds had taught a billionaire how to listen to souls. The man who had everything had learned that the greatest wealth was authentic human connection. And together, they proved that the most powerful communication happens not in the words we speak, but in the silence between them, where the deepest truths have always resided, waiting only for someone who could read the universal language of the human heart. Sofia and Eduardo's story became a beacon of hope in an often dehumanizing corporate world. Their legacy was measured not in billions of dollars or magazine covers, but in the thousands of lives transformed by the simple yet revolutionary idea that differences are not disabilities. They are cognitive diversities essential to human progress. The cafe where it all began stands as a silent witness to the fact that the most unlikely encounters can spark the most necessary changes. And in every gesture of understanding, in every look of genuine connection, in every silence that speaks louder than words, lives the spirit of the girl who taught the world that true listening comes from the heart, not the ears.